we thought that we would, it would be good for members, if they're coming on a little earlier, to at least see what the position that the League of Women Voters of Minnesota
Sure.
has adopted. And at the last convention in 2022, it was, members had proposed an amendment to elevate the direct election of the president by popular vote as a prominent listed component of making democracy work. And previously, since 1970, we have actually had a position to have the Electoral College be ended rather than reformed, because it's, you know, the concept of one person, one vote is in the Electoral College. And they were concerned about the states having proportional representation, because that would be more likely to end in a tie. And if it goes in a tie, the House of Representatives decides the president, and it's only one vote per state.
So Professor Schultz, as you know, you're addressing the League of Women Voters resolution, I guess, that we want to basically do without the Electoral College one way or another. Get your opinions on if that's possible and if it's likely and what would be the path to that. So
okay.
All you can take it away.
Well, I'm going to, okay, so thank you very much. I'm going to actually do a broader talk today and then eventually get down to the issue of the Electoral College. And the broader talk, what I want to do today is really sort of assessing American democracy and assessing its future. Because I know as I was looking at some of your opening screens here and some of the other issues that you're looking at here, not just about the Electoral College, issues about campaign finance, et cetera, what I want to do is at least initially a broader sweep about sort of some of the challenges facing American democracy right now, work us down to eventually what I think are a small list of possible solutions, including in that is in terms of addressing the issue of the Electoral College. So for many of you, you're going to get far more than you were probably banking on this morning. And so let me get started. We like to think of American democracy, or America, as the greatest democracy in the world. To use the metaphor that started with the John Winthrop back when the Pilgrims came to the United States, we like to think of ourselves as what? The shining city on the hill, the beacon when it comes to freedom and democracy. Unfortunately, the reality is that we're falling far short of that promise. If we look at two of the major sort of places out there that evaluate democracy, Freedom House as well as The Economist, we have fallen dramatically in the last few years. The Economist, for example, lists us as a flawed democracy now. We face numerous problems. And what I want to do today is talk about sort of the unfortunate reality of American democracy now. All right, so let me first start off what I would say would be the myths of American democracy. Think of the first three words of the Constitution, we the people. When we think of those first three words, we have this sense of broad inclusivity, this idea that it's a democracy for all of us. As Benjamin Franklin walked away from the Constitutional Convention, when somebody said to him, "What kind of government do we have? What did you propose?" Benjamin Franklin repeatedly said, "A republic if you can keep it," challenging us with the hope that we were creating a republic. It was what we hoped in 1787, America as the product of political consensus and political agreement. It was supposedly a shared commitment to human rights, to individual rights. It was a shared commitment to the fact that everybody was supposed to have a voice in our system. It was what? In part, this is what the American dream was, the American dream of democracy in a popular government. As I oftentimes say to my students, though, I say to them, in assessing American democracy, we really need to ask three questions. We need to ask first, who governs? Two, how do we govern? And three, for what purposes do we govern? By the way, people are talking about microphone issues here. My microphone is on full loud here. There's not much more that I can do on my end here. So if there is a problem on your, it may be very well on your end in terms of broadcast or something like that. But I can't do any more than I can do here. My microphone is at 100%, by the way. Right. So if we think about these questions, who governs, how, for what purposes, if we think about the story of what America was supposed to be, embodied in those three words, we the people. Supposedly we created a democracy. As I tell my students, this story about creating American democracy is a story about what we call Madisonian democracy. Madisonian democracy, the term that the political scientists use, is a phrase that refers to the idea that the principal architect of the Constitution was James Madison. The principal architect of the Bill of Rights was James Madison. It was, to him, most of the critical ideas were done. It is supposed to be this idea that creating a broad, diverse, competitive republic with checks and balances, separation of powers, with bicameralism, with federalism, with a list of eventually constitutional rights, would be a system that would balance majority rule and minority rights. It would be, as what Michael Kamen described, the historian. He said that the framers hoped to create, in his phrase, a machine that would go of itself, that we would create a constitutional structure, a structure that would operate like a machine and produce and reproduce democracy over time. Or, as the historian, also James McGregor Burns, talked about, he said it was the American experiment, the experiment in democracy, to see how it was possible to create a political system that would create the first real democracy or popular government in the world. Unfortunately, the reality was that we didn't have a democracy at the initial point. Thurgood Marshall, former Supreme Court Justice, in 1987, gave a famous speech, and he talked about how we the people really was limited, quite limited in the sense of saying it was we, the affluent, property-owning white males who were Protestant over the age of 21 people. His argument was, if we looked at the original Constitution, it was actually quite flawed. Systems in place, such as age restrictions on who could run, systems in place in terms of the compromises over slavery, in terms of how we set up representation, and for our purposes today, compromises over voting rights and compromises over how we select the President of the United States, including creating the Electoral College, a system in place which did not allow for direct popular vote for the people, a system premised in part because, I would argue, our framers didn't completely trust the people. Why am I sketching all this out? On one level, our myth of American democracy is the idea that our framers were altruistic. Our framers were looking out for our best interests. We're looking out for creating a democracy. But in many ways, one can also argue that the framers were what? As the historian Richard Hofstadter pointed out, they were politicians. They were self-interested. As Charles Beard pointed out, they were what? Property owners. They were slaveholders. It is possible, as I tell my students, that they designed a system not necessarily for democracy and for we the people, but for them. I sometimes say to my students, is it merely coincidence, or is it by design that the people who designed the Constitution, the profile of those individuals, the profile of those who could vote, the profile of those who served in Congress in 1787, pretty much looks like the profile of those who actually still serve in Congress, those who still hold positions of power, both public and private. It is possible that a democracy designed or a government designed in 1787 was not meant to be inclusive, but that instead it was actually quite exclusive. Thurgood Marshall, in the speech that I mentioned to you back in 1987, said that yes, it was a flawed system then. But his argument was, as a result of a civil war, a civil rights revolution, as a result of 26, 27 amendments to the Constitution, we've had dramatically expanded and created a much better government in the United States, more inclusive than before. And in many ways, what we look at here is that there are many virtues. There are many things that work well in American democracy. We do have many freedoms for many of us. We have many of us who vote. We have generally competitive elections, and we have many opportunities to express our views through multiple channels. Economically, the system delivers goods. What I mean by goods, prosperity for many, but certainly not all. There are many things that we can point to in terms of the strength of American democracy. But at the same time, there are many defects, things that are a challenge for our political system. What we know is that, unfortunately, and I'm going to come back to this in terms of thinking about all the issues that we need to address at some point. Among the things we need to be thinking about here is that what? We now have, starting in the 1970s to the present, the greatest gap between the rich and poor that we've ever had in American history, compared to our peers, which I would include Canada, Great Britain, France, the Scandinavian countries, the greatest gap between rich and poor. In terms of social mobility, the ability of people who are in the poorest levels to work all their way up, the classic American dream. In the old days, the Horatio Alger myth, the idea that any of us could become a millionaire. The reality is there are only 7% of us who are born in the bottom fifth ever actually rise to the top fifth in terms of economics. And of those in the top fifth, only 7% ever fall out of it. We've developed fairly rigid class lines that overlay with race, that overlay with oftentimes gender. Where we are born, our location, our region, have huge determinants in terms of our prospects in life. Again, we like to talk about how, to some extent, we have a great democracy. In the last two elections, especially in 2020, we like to pat ourselves on the back and say that we got over 61% voter turnout. Again, compared to our peers, France, Great Britain, Germany, Scandinavian countries, we have the lowest voter turnout in the world of about major democracies. We are actually down with what? We are down with countries such as like Mexico and countries we generally don't like to compare ourselves to. We are a country, and we live in an area, as we all know, especially in the Twin Cities. I live approximately 9 miles from where George Floyd was murdered. We live in a country divided by race, by class, by gender, by region, by religion. We are a hugely divided country in so many ways. Additionally, what this suggests is that despite the promise of we the people, many are excluded. Many are excluded from the political system. Many are excluded from the economic benefits of our society. Again, if I can bring it closer to home, in terms of the Twin Cities, I know in Minnesota, we like to pat ourselves on the back and think of how good of a democracy we are. The fact that we have the highest voter turnout in the country at 80%. But if we look at it beneath voter turnout, we have an incredible voter turnout and voter registration for white Caucasians, 87, 88%. Get to individuals of color, Latino, Black, Hispanic, Native Americans, voter registration is in the mid-50s. We live, unfortunately, in a state that has among the worst racial disparities in the country across every parameter, whether it's education, whether it is voting, criminal justice, incarceration, you name it, we're among the worst. It's terrible to say. What I'm getting at is that as a political system, designed, at least in theory, what we all learned in school, as I tell people, it's the cherry tree story. What I mean by the cherry tree story, remember all of us growing up and heard the story about what supposedly George Washington cut down the cherry tree with an axe and then asked who did it. And he says, I cannot tell a lie, I did it. Well, of course, that story never occurred. That incident never happened. But I call it our cherry tree history. Our cherry tree history is about those first three words, as I said, we the people. But again, throughout history, we have been far more exclusive than inclusive. I could talk about how, yes, at one level, we have over time expanded franchise rights. But at the same time, there's been an ugly counter side of which we now see again in American history of disenfranchising people. We fight over that. What we have emerged into now, where we are in America in 2023, is what I tell people, we live in a bimodal curve world. And what I mean by that, if 50 years ago, we plotted out public opinion, asked people their views on a range of issues, and plotted it out from the most liberal to the most conservative, excuse me, 50 years ago, American public opinion would have formed a bell curve. The vast majority of the public converged to the center. There was broad political consensus toward the center regarding how people viewed a variety of issues. But over time, that has changed. And what we now see is a situation where we live in a bimodal, polarized world. We live in a world in which we've got a lot of people over to the left, a lot of people over to the right, and very few in the center. We've got political parties that used to be coalitional that have now sorted themselves out ideologically. We now have political parties that are either liberal or conservative, but not mixed. We live in a political system now where it's not just by ideology, it is by race, it is by gender, it is by region. We are polarized in enormous ways, in ways that we've never been. Now, is this the most polarized ever in American history? No. That clearly was the Civil War. The early 1960s, a country divided by the Vietnam War, where we had a president, his brother, several civil rights leaders, all assassinated. That's divided. But yes, we are hugely divided right now. We live in a political system which in 1787, when the framers designed it, was not meant to have political parties. The original conception of the Electoral College was that the person who got the most electoral votes would be president. The person who got the second most would become vice president. There was no slate of president and vice president. There was no ticket set up the way we have now. But very quickly, parties did emerge. And perhaps in one of the most prophetic speeches ever given in American politics, George Washington, in his farewell speech in 1796, lamented the rise of political parties in terms of how party loyalty would come to divide this country, that people would put party ahead of country, and how bad that would be. And the reason why I mention this is that our political system was designed to operate on political consensus, designed to operate without political parties. And the fact of the matter is, our system can't work effectively the way we have it set up now. Yes, we've somehow jerry-rigged. We somehow have figured out how to accommodate sort of political parties. But those were parties that were ideologically diverse. As I say to my students, we now have European-style political parties in the United States. In Great Britain, if you told me Labour Party leaned left, I would say, of course. The Tories lean conservative, yes. We never used to have that. We've got so divided of parties. Those parties are unable to work together. We have created a system because of that, where we really have what? A winner take all political system. Whoever controls the House, whoever controls the Senate or the presidency, or if you get the trifecta, or at the state level, minority voices don't matter anymore. All this is pretty dangerous in terms of our political system. Additionally, and we saw this over the last few years, what also held America together were a series of what political scientists call informal norms, norms that you just took for granted. The most consequential election in American history was 1800, I would argue. It is when John Adams and the Federalist Party lost, and Thomas Jefferson and his party took over. Yes, there were hard feelings. Yes, there were some squabbles, but it was a peaceful transition of power, and the losers conceded that they lost. That carried on throughout American history, whether it was Nixon in 1960 losing closely to Kennedy, Al Gore losing close to George Bush in 2000, Secretary Clinton losing closely to Donald Trump in 2016. But in 2020, we busted that. We busted those informal norms. I am still doing interviews now. What is it, the first week of February, involving Carrie Lake out in Arizona, who still is suing, claiming widespread voter fraud, claiming to try to overturn the election, even though there's no evidence whatsoever that that was the case. We know in 2020, 61 lawsuits were brought by Trump and his allies, lost in all of them. Yet nonetheless, probably 40% of the American public still believes the elections were stolen. Donald Trump himself, trying not to be partisan, refused to acknowledge that he lost and has never have done so. What we're talking about is a threat to those norms. Additionally, if we think about what so many put their faith in, was a Supreme Court to be out there to check and protect our rights. Well, the history of the Supreme Court has never really been to defend the weak and the powerless. There was a small window post-World War II, perhaps 1950s up until perhaps maybe the 1970s or 80s, where the Supreme Court acted as a counteracting power against majority excesses. But as we're starting to see, it is no longer the case. The Dobbs opinion that was issued last year overturning Roe versus Wade is a pretty good example of that. What am I getting at here? It's pretty broad-based, pretty significant in terms of what I'm trying to argue here, is that we're a political system built upon some myths of which then we did expand and did do a lot of good things to try to create a more inclusive democracy. But we were never the democracy that we thought we were. And we have backslidden in the last decade or so, unfortunately. It is, as I pointed out to you now, in America, hugely divided by class. We know it is in America, as we know from the Twin Cities, hugely divided by race. Arguably one of the greatest political scientists ever, wrote E.E. Schatzsnyder, wrote a book called The Semi-Sovereign People. And he argued, and I love this quote here, he says, and the flaw in the pluralist heaven referring to American democracy, and the flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly choir sings with a strong upper class bias. The people who vote tend to be more affluent. The people who are in office tend to be more affluent. The people who operate the major machineries of government, of the private sector, all of them share the same profile. When I teach, I'm going to type this into the chat box here. When I teach, I write this phrase on the board for my students. Let me put it in here. WASP $M21. What I tell people is that, guess what? The people who created this country were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, had money, were male over the age of 21. Largely the same profile of people who are in power to this day. In many ways, I would argue that the Madisonian experiment has at best an ambiguous legacy. It is a legacy that, again, has delivered for many, but has excluded many others. Michael Parenti, a book that I used when I was an undergraduate in political science, I read, wrote a book called Democracy for the Few. And that may be exactly what we have, a democracy for the few. So the challenges we face challenges, as I mentioned to you, race, class, gender. We face challenges, of course, we could talk about in a different day, globally, environmentally, ideologically. But we also face challenges in terms of structure and process. Again, my students sometimes accuse me of acting as or teaching as if people don't matter. And what I mean by that, I am tremendously interested in the plate tectonic issues that structure American politics, the structures that hold our political system together. And part of what I would argue is that we have the oldest democracy in the world, or oldest something in the world, the oldest constitution in the world. We designed a political system in a pre-industrial era for a horse and buggy era at a point when we were an incredibly homogeneous country, or at least we thought we were. We ignored the fact that 1/3 of the American population were slaves, 1/3, 1/4. We are now the 21st century, the third decade of the 21st century. A lot of things need to be changed. A lot of things need to be amended. And on my list, and I'm eventually going to get to in just the next couple of minutes here, I'm going to talk about the Electoral College. On my list are a bunch of things that need to be changed and addressed. Many of them, I think, dovetail with what you have to say. But let me tell you a story. Some of you may remember back in the 90s, I was the executive director and president of Common Cause Minnesota. In 1998, I had the pleasure of bringing Archibald Cox to Minnesota. Remember, he was the special prosecutor fired by Richard Nixon in the famous Saturday Night Massacre. Archibald Cox came on the 25th anniversary. We brought him out in October specifically for that reason. He was also the president of National Common Cause. And he said something very profound to me. And he was only talking about money and politics at that time. And what he said, that the rules about who gets money in politics are the rules that determine the rules of the game. And he went on to say, think about board games like Monopoly, like Risk, or the Game of Life. Some of you probably have played all those board games. There are basic rules to those games. Those rules, if followed, decide how the game is played. And that's what he was getting at here. What he was focusing on is saying, I am concerned, that is Archibald Cox, with the basic rules of the game that we need to address. And at the top of his list, and still at the top of my list, is who gets to give money and for what purposes in our political system. Unfortunately, we have a US Supreme Court that has largely struck down almost all the post-Watergate reforms. We have very weak laws regarding money in politics. We know in the midterm elections that just ended a few months ago, the estimates were 18 billion. Yeah, I say B as in billion. $1 billion was spent in the political process. More than any midterm election in American history, more than any presidential election in American history. Post Citizens United, the amount of money pouring in from corporate power, corporate interest has just exploded. It has unleashed incredible amounts of money from that era. We need more than anything else to address that issue. Unfortunately, we got a Supreme Court stacked against it. Unfortunately, with all that money being spent by large corporate interests, they can lobby. They can use that money to elect candidates they want. They have an ability to now rig the system to their advantage. But we need to address that. A second thing that's become clear to me over the years that we need to do is we need uniform federal standards for voting and registration across the country. Is that among the things that the framers did was to say that states would be responsible for running the federal elections subject to time, manner, and place restrictions by Congress. We know across the country that we have a variety of patterns in terms of how people register to vote regarding things such as felon disenfranchisement. We have a whole bunch of different issues and a patchwork process for voting. It is confusing. In some states, for example, for Florida for many years, commit a felon, you are barred from voting for the rest of your life. In the state of Minnesota, I think we're ready to change the law, but you commit a felon in Minnesota, getting your voting rights restored was complex. Maybe now it'll be easier if the legislation passes, but still, we need something across the board in terms of addressing voter ballots and so forth like that, so that we can ensure that whether you're in Alabama, Minnesota, New York, or California, or Montana, it's the same standards that apply no matter what. Because in many ways, we really don't have national elections. And given the fact that the Electoral College renders our political system as what? 50 separate plus the District of Columbia separate elections. In effect, what? We don't have any national election for president. We don't have a one person, one vote at that level. We basically have what? 50 separate elections with 50 different standards. Other things that I would do. We have a gerrymandering problem across the country. Part of the problem with the gerrymandering is that we let, as one of my friends used to say, we let elected officials pick their voters in terms of drawing the districts. And to a large extent, that seems wrong. In fact, I think completely seems wrong. I think what we need to have among federal uniform standards is basically requiring states to have nonpartisan or bipartisan, or whatever you're going to call it, redistricting commissions that are out there. Back in the early 1980s, Minnesota had a constitutional amendment on the ballot to do that, but it failed. It got a majority of the voters, but not a majority of people who voted, and it failed. When I was at Common Cause, every year we lobbied on this to find no interest among the state legislators. Now, would this create more competitive elections? Perhaps. But again, we are so polarized in this country. Think about how difficult it would be to draw districts in Minneapolis or St. Paul if you wanted competitive Republican and Democratic districts. I don't know how you would do it. Democrats and Republicans have sorted themselves out geographically. As I'd like to point out to people, we have sorted ourselves out geographically by party, and Democrats and Republicans also sort themselves out in terms of their consumer product preferences. As I have pointed out so many times in the last few years, among the best predictors of how areas would vote, the proximity of a region to Whole Foods, Chick-fil-A, or Cracker Barrel restaurants. That is how polarized we are. But needless to say, the commissions are needed. I know we live in a state with ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, when initially proposed, was supposed to be an idea for what? Eliminating primaries to make them more cost effective. It was supposed to be an idea for creating more competitive elections, for the idea of making sure that whoever got elected got a majority of the vote. Over time, the argument for ranked choice voting has devolved to the idea of saying that maybe it creates more civil elections, less mean-spirited elections, possibly. But I would say it's worth expanding ranked choice voting. But more importantly, to address the issues also of gerrymandering, to address the issues of the fact that where we live, we've clumped around other people with like minds. We need to think about multi-member districts. We need to think about having districts, the state of Minnesota or in Congress, where what? Where you don't just get to pick one representative, but perhaps a two. And maybe in that situation, in a heavily Democratic area, Republicans could elect somebody or vice versa. I also think that the issues of American politics go beyond some issues regarding government reform. Again, still going to come back to the Electoral College in a couple more minutes here. For example, I'm one of those people who believes there is what? No First Amendment right to lie. That at the end of the day, we have seen rampant lying, whether it's Santos in New York, or again, trying not to be partisan. What is it? The Washington Post cataloged 10,000 lies plus by Donald Trump. or people claiming that there is widespread voter fraud when they don't. At some point, we need to be clamping down on the lying that's going on in our political system. With that, at one point, we had what was called the fairness doctrine, a rule that said that the media had to cover opposing viewpoints. We got rid of that fairness doctrine nearly 40 years, almost 50 years ago, actually. I should take it back. When the court originally upheld the fairness doctrine, it did so by saying the focus is not on the free speech rights of the speaker, but on the rights of the public to secure correct information. Our political system only works if we actually have good education and good information. With that, back when I was with Common Cause, again, many years ago, I said one of the big challenges in America and in Minnesota was civic education, that most Americans just don't know much about the political process. Two of my professors, Michael Della Carpini, being one of them, wrote a book when I went to Rutgers for my master's degree back out east, where I'm from, wrote a book called What Americans Don't Know About Politics and Why It Matters. We are woefully, for lack of a better term, ignorant about our political process. We need to do a much better job in terms of education. We also need to address racial and class disparities in America. And maybe we can't do that until we do all the above, but maybe we can't do all the above until we do that. That's the feedback loop. And we need to address the incredible amount of power that corporations exercise in American politics. They wield enormous influence. Now, there's one other reform we need to do. It's the Electoral College. For the last 8 or 9 years, I have written several books called Presidential Swing States. And the whole premise of the book was a conversation that I had with Stacy Hunter Hecht, who used to teach at Bethel College. We used to appear together on Almanac. Unfortunately, Stacy passed away quite young at 47 from breast cancer. But Stacy and I became friends. And it was in 2014, Stacy turned to me and she said, you know, the presidential election is already over in about 40 states. And I said, yeah, you're right. Because of the fact of the Electoral College, because of the fact that in 48 of the 50 states, it was a winner-take-all system in order to win electoral votes in that state. We could tell 10 years in advance, or not 10 years in advance, we could tell 2 years in advance who was going to win New York, California, Texas, who was going to win in all but 10 states. Those were the swing states. Those were the only states that mattered. And remember, because of the Electoral College, the race is not to get the most popular vote. The race is to get to 270 electoral votes. We found in those 10 swing states, only about 10% of the voters mattered. What we argued, and I could type it in here again for my message here. We argued that American politics came down to 10-10-270. 10% of the voters in 10 states determined who got to 270 electoral votes. We were arguing, excuse me, at that point, we thought only about 200,000 voters mattered, at least based upon the 2012 election. Well, we had to amend it. What we found is that actually coming out of 2016 is that we noticed that within those 10 swing states, there were only a few counties that truly ever actually mattered. Candidates only campaigned in several counties. And so we started to amend it. Again, typing in some numbers here. What we started to argue is that 10% of the voters located in 18 counties in 10 states got us to what? Who won 270 electoral votes. But then, unfortunately, by this point, Stacy had passed away. I started doing analysis with my new co-author, and we came to a couple of other conclusions, that maybe the number of swing states wasn't even 10, maybe it was less. In 2016, move 90,000 electoral votes In Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, move those the other way, Hillary Clinton would have won the presidency. She would be president. 90,000 votes. But even then, I did a piece for the Philadelphia Inquirer, great newspaper back east. And one of the title of my piece was called "As Scranton Goes, So Goes the Nation." Now, I like Scranton because A, Joe Biden's from there, Hillary Clinton's from there. My mother's family is from there. I know Scranton very well. An old coal mining Iron Range type of town. Nothing like the town that you see in the television series The Office, of which I never watched, by the way. Democrats were historically winning Lackawanna County, where Scranton is located, winning it by 20%. And what I argued in the piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer, if Trump won Lackawanna County or got close, he would win Pennsylvania. If he won Pennsylvania, he would win the presidency. Well, Clinton only won it by 2 percentage points. It was close. Trump went on to win Pennsylvania, went on to win the presidency. I could argue only one state matters. And then what we found in 2020, move 43,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, and Trump would have been the president of the United States again. I am not quite to the point of saying how Harry and Louise vote on Front Street in Scranton, Pennsylvania decides the election, but that's what's happened. And this is an artifact of the Electoral College, an artifact of the fact that the vast majority of us, whether we show up to vote on election day in a presidential election, doesn't matter. As I sometimes kid with my students, that if you're in California, New York, Texas, and a few other states, you might as well stay home on election day and eat bean dip. Your vote does not matter if you're in the minority party in that state. Additionally, we know in those states that as a result, voter turnout in the non-competitive states is lower. We know in those states that in general, they're not paid attention to. Conversely, we know in the presidential swing states, they're the center of more campaign activity. They are the center of a lot more spending for campaign spending, whether good or bad. But we also know, one of my friends argued, that those are the states that get more per capita in terms of federal financial aid over time. They are the states that are treated differently. The point that I'm getting at is that the Electoral College creates perversities. Yes, many of you are probably expecting me to talk about the fact that we've had 6 elections in American history where the winner of the popular vote did not become the president. Yes, that's a problem. It is a problem. But I would argue the fiction, or rather the construction, I should say, that's the word I'm looking for, the construction of swing states over time, where some states, some votes matter and some don't matter for the presidential election, is even a more serious problem than before. It is, with the Electoral College, a system where we do not have a national election. As I said to you, we've got 50 states plus the District of Columbia, 51 separate elections under 51 different standards for who is eligible to vote. We do not produce really a consensus candidate. And given the fact with the Electoral College that we've got the biases in place based upon compromises over slavery, compromises over the big and small states in the Constitutional Convention. We've got states such as South Dakota, states such as Wyoming, that have 3 electoral votes, even though their population is so small that in many ways it gives them a disproportionate influence in the system. Yes, on one level, it's a protection for federalism. It was supposed to be a way through the Electoral College to protect small states, to ensure that they would be paid attention to ensure they have some voice. But as I argue with my students, all the promises that were written about what the Electoral College is supposed to be have not come to fruition. The electors, who were supposed to be wise sages, have turned out to be partisan political hacks. They were supposed to be individuals who could exercise independent discretion in terms of their choices, but many states have now passed faithless electors laws, like in Minnesota, that bind them. We know that small states are passed over right now. They're ignored. No one goes to the Wyomings of the world. No one goes to the Montanas of the world. As I pointed out to you, only a few counties and a few swing states. Only a few voters truly matter. We also know that the framers were hoping that the Electoral College would overcome parochialism, would overcome regionalism. Well, look at the maps. The Democrats are winning roughly the same places overall in the last 25, 30 years. The Republicans are doing the same. We've got clear and distinct patterns in terms of what's happening. I could work through a whole bunch of flaws in terms of the Electoral College. The question then becomes, what do we do? Well, on one level, if we look at all the constitutional amendments that have ever been proposed in the United States, the single most frequent constitutional amendment has been what? Has been to get rid of the Electoral College. The last major burst was Frank Church, Senator Frank Church, back in the 1970s when Congress was moving toward it. Public opinion, about 60% of the American public opinion would like to get rid of the Electoral College. No other country in the world has this. We are the only country in the world where we do not have a direct voice, do not have a right to vote for our national executive. As we learned in Bush v. Gore, the famous Supreme Court case that resolved the 2000 presidential election, the Supreme Court pointed out to us, we have to even this day no constitutional right to vote for the president of the United States. That theoretically, Minnesota or Wisconsin could say tomorrow, we're no longer going to grant a right to vote for the president, and we as a state legislature are going to directly pick our electors. And if you think that isn't a fear, think about what happened in 2020, where there were efforts to try to get some states to actually pick their own electors and to bypass the election process as a result of sort of questions about unfounded fears of stolen elections. In Florida 2000, at one point, when they were trying to resolve the dispute there was an effort by the legislature they considered of doing the same thing. My point here is that the Electoral College has never worked the way it's supposed to. It has produced a system where we have no right to vote for president. It has produced these anomalies about swing states. It has produced, again, as many of you were thought about when I was going to start the talk today, has produced a situation where we have popular vote versus Electoral College vote victories. Should we get rid of it? Well, again, about 60% of the American public says yes, but guess what? We are now also partisanly divided over the Electoral College. The vast majority of Republicans still support it. Remember, to amend the to change the Electoral College, to get rid of it, you would need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. I doubt we can get 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states to agree that sunshine feels great on a cold day or on a warm day, whatever we're looking for here. We are so divided. Yeah. For the last few years, speaking on the Electoral College has been one of my most frequent topics, along with another one about polarization. If I could wave, and I actually have it here, if I could wave my magic wand, see, I have a magic wand here, I would get rid of the Electoral College tomorrow. I would say we need to join modern democracies and say there's a right to vote and a right to vote for our national president. I'm skeptical in the short term that we're going to be able to do that. Now, maybe if we build a grassroots movement, if we work on it, we could do it. The second best option, not my favorite, is to say, how about eliminating winner take all in the remaining states? Certainly not my first choice, but if we got rid of the winner take all for the Electoral College in the other 48 states, and this would again take statute at the state level, would it address all the problems that I've talked about in terms of the Electoral College? No. Would it get us closer? Yes. I don't know which is the preferred strategy. Again, whether you do one first or go for the electoral college and try to eliminate it outright, or do you go through the winner take all system first, or do you pursue both of them? That's a strategic question I haven't talked about at this point. And I'm going to end my talk right here and say that, guess what? What we need to be thinking about is where do we go in the future? Now, I'm going to say one last thing, although this is all about the last few minutes of the Electoral College. The main thing I also want us to think about here is that there are other challenges. Don't think there's a single panacea for all of our problems in democracy. I'm going to end with one of my favorite quotes, Louis Brandeis. We can have a democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of few, but we can't have both. I still think we need to address that wealth issue, and that wealth issue ties into so many other issues, including the Electoral College. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that there have been a couple of questions written in the chat, and we think we might start with Paul Huffmans. He is with the League of Women Voters of Minnesota and has been very involved in the redistricting issues. And let me just see what his question is. I took a picture of it so that I would have that. He said, it seems that some of the divides today, rural versus urban, conservative versus progressive, have been longstanding. Dr. David Potter, in An Impending Crisis, describes a situation in the 1850s that seems to have some parallels to today. Is there anything to this?
Yes, actually there is, Paul. In my intro American politics class for my students, there's a book that I have my students read. Yale has a series called Short Introductions, and it's called A Short Introduction to American Political History. And the author, and I'm forgetting the name of it right now, points out the fact that throughout American history, we have faced repeated problems that have just continued over time. Federalism issues, federalism versus national power, race issues, wealth concentrations, et cetera, et cetera. As I tell my students at the beginning of the semester, I write on the board the words race, class, gender, region, religion. And I say, these are the 5 basic points of conflict in American history. And what? They have always been there. So we are still dealing with the fundamental basic divides that we started off with in 1787. And in many ways, our political system is premised upon these divides and have really done very little to address them over time. So we are stuck in some ways in time with our political institutions in terms of how they perform and operate.
Thank you. And then the next question, we might just because, let me just get this. It's about the fairness doctrine. I believe that there was a rule promulgated by the FCC under their power over their licensees that granted to use the public airwaves, meaning that the radio waves over which radio and TV stations broadcast. However, with the advent of cable and satellite, only content providers, plus the addition of the internet, none of which rely on public airwaves for their dissemination. I think the FCC began to realize that their ability to control this content would soon go away. Add that to the likely pressure from businesses, broadcast license holders, to be let out from under this burden. The FCC caved in. She asks, am I right with that?
You're right in terms of it, but we're also, I think, and this is part of what Amy Klobuchar did in the book that she came out in terms of what antitrust or monopoly, I think was earlier this year, I mean, it was last year, something like that, is that we need to be rethinking, excuse me, I'm sorry, our antitrust and First Amendment doctrines for the 21st century, that to a large extent, we need to be thinking of the internet as a utility, we need to be thinking of the of social media as a utility, and given how much information people get from them, again, our focus should be, this is why the fairness doctrine analogy is important. Our focus should not solely be upon the right of the speaker, but the right of the public to receive truthful and fair information. And so everything that person said is correct. But having said that, we need to rethink how we think about the fairness doctrine and what it covers for the 21st century.
Thank you. Next question, Janet Avery asks, in 2018, Paul Thiessen, then in the legislature, introduced a state amendment to have Minnesota join the National Popular Vote Compact or Interstate Vote Compact. Do you see action like this here in the coming months?
I'm not sure we do at this point. I mean, there's a partisan divide here. Why would the Democrats at this point in control want to sort of say we've got a reliable 10 electoral votes going for a Democrat? Why would they want to take a chance and set up a system at this point that might now eventually throw the electoral votes onto the Republican side? So it might happen, but I am really quite skeptical regarding it. I will also say I've gone back and forth on this a half a dozen times, and I've actually now decided that I don't support the national popular vote for a variety of reasons. That if we're going to still have the Electoral College, as flawed as it may be, for Minnesotans to say we voted for a Democrat, but we want our 10 electoral votes cast for the way the national popular vote went. Let's say it went for a Republican. There's something kind of skewed about that. So I also think there are some problems constitutionally, which I won't bore you folks with today, regarding the national popular vote and whether or not it actually needs congressional assent to be able to do it. But I think I've come out finally against the national popular vote. Again, I don't know whether there's any movement to actually adopt it here in the state. I haven't heard anything recently.
Our league position says that it's one way to deal with the presidential election or selection. Do you have, what would you suggest if there's no way that we can do a constitutional amendment? And someone did ask about a constitutional convention, or, I mean, I know that's the other way you could,
right.
But what would you recommend if you were to wave your magic wand?
Well, my first would be to get rid of the Electoral College. My second is, at this point, I've taken as my second position is getting all the states to basically eliminate the winner take all and to go to some type of system that's similar to Nebraska and Maine. Is it an ideal solution? The answer is no, it's not an ideal solution. But again, given the fact that I don't see right now, especially with the partisan divides in this country, the divides between Republicans and Democrats over the Electoral College, even if we went to a constitutional convention, I don't see there's what, 3/4 of the states that are going to opt to get rid of the Electoral College at this point, because so many of the states feel like it works to their advantage at this point, and I think are going to be afraid of losing power and influence. So I'm skeptical, at least right now. Not impossible, because grassroots movements can change things. But again, my first choice would, of course, be getting rid of the Electoral College. Second choice would be eliminating the winner take all.
Thank you. Yeah, back in 1971, they were within one vote of changing that system. And if there was, you didn't get at least 40% of the vote, then there would be a runoff in the presidential candidates. Yeah. I see that there is another question. I think you probably answered it. Wouldn't the blue states be most likely to vote to eliminate voter take all? And if so, wouldn't that disadvantage the Democratic presidential candidates?
Possibly. I mean, right now we're looking at a point where we think that the Democrats are, it's interesting. Go back 30 years ago, people argued that the Republicans have an Electoral College lock. And then for a while, people were saying the Democrats have an Electoral College lock. And now we have people who are saying, well, the Democrats have the popular vote lock, but not the Electoral College lock. Things do shift over time. Right now it does look like the Democrats are going to probably consistently win the popular vote, in presidential elections, and in some elections are going to win the Electoral College, but not at this point. I don't know. Would it help Democrats, or maybe? I don't know. I mean, it's a tough call, but that's the issue at this point, is that a lot of these reforms are being perceived as being partisanly based or benefiting one party as opposed to another. And in a polarized world that we have, so long as that's the perception, nothing's going to happen.
There's another question. Wouldn't an arrangement like Nebraska and Maine encourage even more gerrymandering? That's where they give a proportional votes based on their districts.
Well, that's why I think you would have to couple this with you. If you're going to do that, you have to couple it with a system of nonpartisan redistricting commissions, because unfortunately, a lot of the stuff here is interlocked. Again, I know everybody wants to do the what's the silver bullet, and I'm trying to point out to you folks, there are no silver bullets here. There are lots of things that are interlocked, and the same thing here. I think you have to do the redistricting commissions before you can do the changes to the electoral college at the state level, if that's the direction you're going to go.
Well, I see it's 10 o'clock, and I know you have somewhere else you have to be. So I really want to thank you so much. If there's another last minute question, let me know. A question for Dr. Schultz. Well, much of what you have said, those are part of League's position, a uniform voting standard across all 50 states.
Sure.
I see there's Karen Langston, you had a question? Oh, well. All right. Well, if there is no other requests, I think we will then end this. Thank you so much. And for those of you who are just wanting to talk about this and figure out where League should go, please stay on and we will stop the recording. But thank you very much. It's a very interesting talk you gave.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye now.